Greetings and welcome back. We are in AP English, and our objective for the hour now is to spend some time with the Beowulf epic. However, before we go there, I just want to make a couple of observations about this classic epic, this Babylonian epic that we call the Epic of Gilgamesh. You're only reading a small part from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I want to talk just briefly about why this epic is of significance. Let's point out, first of all, that while it seems like we're reading lots and lots of these epics, the truth of the matter is we're actually reading not enough. It is sad that there are so many epics of different cultures and times that we're not even really referencing at all, and that is an oversight. The Epic of Gilgamesh, I feel, though, is so important for two reasons. One, it is one of our very earliest, what we will call, Western epics. It comes from the area of Mesopotamia. Of course, we today know of this because we fought a war there as Baghdad, right? Where the Tigris and the Euphrates meet. What's significant about the finding of this epic is that when it was finally discovered, two really important things. One, how old it was. It was a very ancient story. A story that had been, I'll now use a term, redacted. That is to say, told and retold and retold and retold. First in an oral tradition and then ultimately in a written tradition. It's one of the older stories that we can find. Two, this epic tells the story of a universal flood. Of a universal flood that covered much of the known world. Now this would make sense because we have some flood stories in the Nile area, as well as, of course, now in the Euphrates, Tigris area. These huge rivers would at times overflow, and there would be tremendous flooding. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells, however, the story of an individual who is saved through a flood, in spite of a flood, a large flood. Immediately, scholars were aware this was a story that predated anything Hebrew by 1,000 years, which obviously raised the question of the Genesis 11 story. For those of you that ever picked up a Bible and read it, there is a flood narrative by a chap named Noah in Genesis 11. And there were a lot of scholars that immediately began to ask the question, whoa, where did the story of the Noah story of Genesis 11 come from? Probably of Mesopotamian descent. That is to say, the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the story. You can imagine there were one or two biblical readers who were deeply offended / concerned about revelations of this kind. Okay? With that in mind, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a simple epic. It's the story of a hero who goes on a search, has to go through some terrible trials and tribulations before finally coming to some kind of realization of who and what he is. Your reading from your hymnal from the Brown Lit textbook is not very thorough. I recommend that you download a simple summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh, or you can actually download the entire epic and just read it online. It's not that long because we don't have a lot of the Epic of Gilgamesh like we have of other epics. Since we're talking about heroes, though, let's talk about the first identifiable Anglo-Saxon hero, English hero, and his name is Beowulf. So let's go there now, okay? And for the rest of my lecture, I'll be speaking of Beowulf. The Beowulf epic is the epic that we will constitute as the very first English epic. Now, if you'll go ahead and take out your packet real quickly for Beowulf, on page 1, I want to identify some really important stuff regarding language development. We are now, for the first time in our AP conversations, ready to talk about the English language as an important institution, okay, for lack of a better term. Do you see there on the right-hand side of that packet for Beowulf, do you see on the right-hand side there some cursive language? Do you see it? Mr. Schreiber is looking at it. Mr. Schreiber, why don't you attempt to read that for us real quickly, please, if you would? Starting right here where it says, lines from Beowulf in Old English. Give it a try. Go ahead. Give it a shot. We'll support you or laugh at you, one or the other.
Da comb of more under Miss Leo. Is that even a word? Bum. Grendel Gongen. Goddess ear bear. Minde. Say.
All right, let's give him a hand. Nice job. Well done, well done. That was good. You humiliated yourself enough. By the way, let's go ahead and put this on the packet or in your notes. Believe it or not, Mr. Schreiber was just reading English to us. No kidding. Now, for those of you that look at that and say, I'm sorry, that doesn't look like anything I know of as English, let's point out something really important about the Beowulf epic. The Beowulf epic introduces us to the first or some of the earliest instantiations of what we will call Old English. English will be divided into three parts. Old English, Mr. Schreiber just worked through. There aren't very many people left on this planet who can actually read and understand that language anymore. Okay, it's very ancient. English is what we call a hybrid language or an amalgamated language. That is to say, it's synthetic. In other words, there's all of these other languages that combine to form the language we know of as English. Old English then here, the Anglo-Saxon language there that Mr. Schreiber was working with, is nigh unintelligible to us today. The Middle English, step 2 in English formation, the Middle English is the English of Chaucer, we will say, roughly 1300. And when we get to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, we will look at Middle English, and believe it or not, with a little bit of practice, we can actually read it. There's no orthography, there's no spelling, standardized spelling for Chaucer. So he'll spell the same word 4 different ways. For those of us who are bad spellers, this is wonderful, right? It doesn't matter because there's no dictionary. Chaucer is predominantly transcribing an oral tongue, a language that's predominantly spoken, not written. And then finally, Shakespeare, roughly 1600, will qualify as modern English. When we are looking, for example, at the play Macbeth, and we're hearing that performance that we witnessed last week, we are actually listening to the very language that Shakespeare himself wrote. There's no translation needed. When we read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from your purple anthology, you will be working with a translation, okay? You'll be working with a translation. Now, what about dates for originations? Well, I already gave you the two dates of 1600, 1350, roughly from Middle English and later English. Where do we date Beowulf? Two problems here. One, we don't know, and two, we don't know. Okay? This is a problem for us. We really have no clue. We're not even sure the origination of this document called Beowulf. We think sometime around 750 to 1000 Common Era. Notice the age or the date range, roughly the amount of time America has been a country, right? Sometime during that time, we think two priests maybe penned a story that we are pretty certain was long before it was ever written down an oral tale. That is to say, a story that was told over time. A story of a famous warrior named Beowulf, an Anglo-Saxon hero. We'll define that term in a moment. He goes through a series of adventures. All right? So let's go ahead and be somewhat conservative here and say 1000 Common Era is the beginning of English literature. Think about what we just said as you wrote it in your notes. From Beowulf to Hamlet is 600 years of history. Can you understand why my English pals scoff at the suggestion by Americans that America is the greatest civilization of all time? Think about what the British get to say. You've roughly been around 300 years from when Tom and his pals wrote that little ditty about we hold these truths to be self-evident in 1776. 300 years to now for U.S. history. By Shakespeare, England could claim 600 years of history by Shakespeare in 1600. And clearly they have a history beyond Shakespeare, England does. you can kind of see the argument that my English pals are making. When you have 600 years of history, then and only then do you get to qualify as debating about whether you're one of the greatest civilizations of all time. But when you hit 600 years, you're still way behind England in regards to what England was able to produce post-Shakespeare. Kind of see the argument that's being made? To that degree, I think it's probably worthy of saying that we have to have a bit of humility here as we start to think about our own civilization and what it is we've produced. By the way, the statistic I was just sharing with you about 600 years to Shakespeare is a statistic that Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, knew very, very well. There was this genuflecting or worshiping of England and the continent, of course, and all of the great thinkers that were there. Emerson said, it's time for America to have its own voice and to stop genuflecting and worshiping so much Europe and the continent. Whitman heard the call and he wrote Leaves of Grass. Now, does Leaves of Grass stand in the same company with Shakespeare's sonnets? That is a subject of huge debate, not resolvable in room 303. However, I will say off the record, I think so. That's all I'll say on that topic. Let's now talk about the Beowulf epic itself. And although I don't do this very often, I will share a small bit of biography with you because, Miss Katie, this maybe helps. I was not raised in the United States for most of my life, and I didn't go to schools in the United States for most of my life. And when I was in the United States, I went to private schools and academies. I was privileged to, in my 9th grade year, attend a private academy on a university campus. Our English teacher kept talking about this chap that was going to visit us, and she was quite excited. We were not, because we were freshmen. And I can remember vividly, I'm fairly old now, and yet I still remember this moment as if it were just a few days ago. This guy walks into the room, and he looks every bit like a university Don scholar. I mean, he's like he hasn't been out in the sun for like 14 years, white, all this thick pop bottle glasses, and she introduces us to this, guy, and we have our spitwads ready to go. We're freshmen, and we're going to disrupt his presentation in any way we can. We were freshman boys, and he walks to the front and he says, "Hello, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and I am going to talk to you about an epic poem named Beowulf." And of course, we're all getting ready to disrupt. He does, and looking back, of course, I now understand, Mr. Kelleher, that what he was doing was all theatrical, of course, as great teachers understand. He takes his glasses, his spectacles off, and he sets them on the podium. He shuts his eyes, and he begins to rock slowly, back and forth like this. It's at this point, we're all just like, no, what? Then he opens his mouth. His voice had been this kind of almost feminine, really soft voice. And yet what comes out of his throat is a deep guttural sound from the back of his throat that sounds like German, basically, like he's about to huck up a loogie. And he starts, for lack of a better term, rapping in a language we do not know. At first, our thought is he is possessed, and this is a demonic witnessing that's happening in our freshman English class in this academy school. And he starts rocking back and forth. Well, come to find out, this was an esteemed professor of Old English who had all of Beowulf memorized in Old English, and he was reciting it for us. It would only be years later that I would realize, this was an important moment in my biography, and I didn't even realize it to have been in the company of a scholar of this magnitude. He got us, though. He got us right away. The rhythms of the language were quite remarkable. And now we're ready to start taking a few notes about this Beowulf epic. It had a driving, I said rap, it had a driving rhythm to it that sounded kind of like rap. And it was fairly clear that some of the words were rhyming. Of course, let's point out, Beowulf is poetry. That's what we're reading when we read this poem, is actually poetry. There are some attempts to try to translate from the Old English into poetry. There are other attempts to just say, we'll never get the cadences, let's just tell the story in prose. So some of you, if you pick up, for example, or find online copies of Beowulf, much like our discussions of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, some translators will try to capture the poetic cadence. Others will just say, forget it, let's just tell the story in prose. I think your translation in the Purple textbook tries to somehow capture the poetry of the language. It had a driving force to it. He stopped after a while and opened his eyes, and of course we were all mesmerized by this performance, and then he said, let me tell you the story of this amazing hero named Beowulf. Beowulf is a hero of the Anglo-Saxon origin. Now what is that? Well, England is a rock with a whole bunch of people living on it when Rome invades it. Rome conquers Britannia, Britain. In the process of conquering Britain, Rome does really important things. One, it builds roads. Even today, if you visit England, there are old roads that you can still drive your rental car down. The stones were laid by Roman centurions. No kidding. Two, they were brilliant at moving water. They built these amazing aqueducts that you can still see today. So they had this ability to actually move water across bodies of land. And with that in mind, their technologies had an influence. Three, they brought governance and ideas of law. That came with the language Latin. And it was kind of obviously a forced politics here, right? I mean, it's not like the British people voted that these Romans got to run their show. But serendipitously, as a byproduct, the Romans enforced a certain kind of stability, which goes away 410 Common Era. Now, I'll use the date 410 because I'm following the great writer Gibbon, who will report that Rome falls in 410. Of course, those of us who study our history know Rome did not fall in a day. It fell over a period of years. But we kind of think about 410 as the date when, yeah, it's probably over by that year. 410 years after the birth of Christ. Anytime you write a timeline, you should always put 0 for the birth of Christ, and you should immediately put 410 Common Era. It is a monumental moment in the history of the world. Why? Because a civilization of over 600 years, remember, we roughly will kind of measure Rome from 200 Common Era to 200 before the Common Era to 410 Common Era. That's about 600 years of history. It's actually longer than that. Rome runs the world. There's never been a civilization quite like it that completely dominated. I mean, Dr. Segru made this observation when he talked about Marcus Aurelius running the known world. He really didn't run the known world. I mean, they have total power. But in 410, Rome falls. It would be kind of like this. If this morning, for example, somebody walked up to you and said, dude, did you hear the news that there's like no police anymore in town? Somebody said, what are you talking about? Yeah, dude, last night about 3 in the morning, all of the cops in this town just left. There is no cops in this town. And then somebody says, I heard that was true in Casper as well. And then a third person says to you, that's because there's no cops in all of Wyoming. They all left. Every bit of law enforcement left. To which then a final observer says, I heard everything west of the Mississippi, no cops. All the law enforcement, gone. Now let's be fair. A sophomoric response to this would be, yes. I always wanted to get in my vehicle and just start. I'm not saying I want to do this. Drive as fast as you could through downtown Orland and hit those railroad tracks at the edge of town just to see if you could get any kind of air. I'm not saying I want to do that.
Tried it.
Right? And some of us would say yes. But of course, we're familiar with a less than sophomore answer to that would be, uh-oh, because what does that mean? Well, that immediately means if somebody tries to walk in your house with their 12 gauge to take what you have or to harm you, you've got no 911 to call. You've got no one to call. And in that moment, it becomes immediately every man or woman for himself, herself. Let's qualify this as what happens in England. Immediately, warring states break out. Once those soldiers leave, there is no kind of security left, no forced security, and therefore chaos breaks out. And you have tribal peoples that immediately take up. And you have these tribes run by families, and there's all this infighting, blah, blah, blah. From outside of England will arrive different kinds of people that will then begin invading. We call these people, for lack of a better collective phrase, Norsemen, Northmen. They come from the north. These people are B-A-D, bad. They were told they build ships and they sail these ships in the waters of the North Atlantic Sea. Waters which right now, if you fall into, you're good for about 23 seconds and then you start freezing to death. You know the story of Titanic. And we're told these people, they sailed ships through these waters, open-decked ships. That is to say, they're pretty tough people. Well, what do? Well, for those of you who like at all the early Arnold Schwarzenegger offering called Conan the Barbarian, I cannot suggest much about this film other than to say two things. Schwarzenegger had just won his last all Mr. Universe, and he is looking as fine as he ever looked in his career when he makes that film. That is to say, physically very gifted gentleman. He doesn't look the way you know of him today. I recommend just looking at the film or Googling it just to know that at one point he probably was the best well-built man on the planet. But other than that, I would say this. The film opens with an interesting scene. You have this little tiny village hamlet where all these people are there, they're this pastoral, quiet. And then all of a sudden the picture slips away to these men riding on horseback, these huge men with masks on. And then they will arrive on the village and they completely destroy the village. They just tear up everything. They set it all on fire. They kill most everybody there. Conan, for those of you that know the story, Conan loses his mother to a beheading, and then the young children are taken away as slaves. And the last picture in the opening scene of Conan the Barbarian is the village on fire and everybody's gone. There's nobody left there. Well, what happened is that these Norsemen over time, they stopped destroying the villages and they simply took over the villages. They then became agrarian peoples, and ultimately they stopped their entire life of invasions. They become domesticated vis-a-vis their agriculture. And then they start telling stories. One of the stories that they tell is of a classic warrior named Beowulf. Now, Susan Ehrenstein at the University of Wyoming, who's done tremendous research on this topic at Stanford, it's one of the reasons I recommend that you go to the University of Wyoming and study the honors program. Maybe you'll be blessed to study with her for one semester. She has made the observation that much of this story is really what we call sometimes the bear story as opposed to Beowulf. The bear story, a bear man, a huge man who's great in fighting and in valor and in war. The Beowulf epic ostensibly is a three-part story. Now you're going to know this by reading closely your packet. Your packet will outline, in terms of that information, your packet will outline the important three parts of the story. Part one. Beowulf is a story that begins in a place called the land of the Danes, what we today would call Denmark, that area we today call Scandinavia. There is a famous king named King Hrothgar. By the way, we're told at the very opening lines of Beowulf that the Danish king had died, not Hrothgar, the one who preempted him. And upon his death, the body of that king is taken down to the shoreline, placed inside of a ship, or on top of a ship, with all kinds of jewelry and gold piled on top of him. The ship is then released out into the ocean through the fog. There's a lot of fog in this geographic region. And in the morning, the ship is gone. And of course, the body of the king, gone. This has led a lot of treasure hunters, by the way, to search at the bottom of the North Atlantic to try to see if they can find any of these treasure troves that were reported in these stories, because obviously they'd be worth a whole lot of bank if you could somehow come to those treasures. Hrothgar takes his place. Hrothgar becomes a great and mighty king. We're told that he's so great that he is able to enforce peace. And after doing so, he is the great builder. He does kind of two things. He gives rings, what we call a ring bestower. He likes to give rings and good things to his thanes, T-H-A-N-E-S, which is the Old English word for soldier or knight, okay, warrior. His thanes are given then their rings. He's a ring bestower. The other thing we're told he does is he builds a huge mead hall. Now what is mead? Well, a few years ago they discovered actually some of this mead, which is just another word for beer. They discovered it, and the predictions was that it was close to 200 proof, which is unbelievably intoxicating. But what's more important, and this is huge, they found that these men did not drink their beer, their mead, out of glasses. They rather drank them out of bowls, large bowls that required two hands to hold. And the predictions here were by scholars whoa, 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 to be able to drink that kind of alcohol, you had to be a huge person. Well, right, that's right. Apparently these are huge men. There are findings of swords that weigh close to 50 pounds. Now, we could go into the weight room now, and I could ask you to pick up a 50-pound barbell, and for most of you, that would at least be work. But if I were to tell you that you had to swing it over your head, okay, a sword, then all of a sudden we're getting a picture of the kinds of men that we're talking about. These are huge men who love to fight in hand-to-hand combat. Well, Hrothgar builds a huge mead hall, a meeting place, where all of his Thane's warriors can come and they can have these parties, these drinking parties, singing parties. There's lots of happiness and joy. Until, into our story now comes our villain. You gotta have a monster in all epics, right? You gotta have a villain. The Grendel monster. Now, Grendel is an interesting monster. When the film was made for the very first time, Aliens, a film that some of you are familiar with because of a return by the film Prometheus, recently released in DVD. For those of you that know about this film from the 80s, the very first original was called Aliens. The question for the maker of that film, Ridley Scott, was, how can I make a really bad villain? And they went back and they studied all bad monsters, and the monster they settled on was Grendel. Grendel is a terribly scary monster who comes or derived, we're told, from the seed of Cain. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you did pick up your Bible and you read the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Judeo-Christian Bible, you know that there's a story there about two brothers named Cain and Abel. Cain will kill his brother Abel, and instead of being killed by God, we're told that Cain is given a special mark, a disfigurement of some kind. The interpretation of this has run the range, racial epithets and the rest of it. But the Anglo-Saxons believed that this monster was that derivation from Cain, the terrible Cain who killed his brother. Grendel is a monster who lives in the boggy lands. For those of you that have heard the term boogie man, it comes from the word boggy man. What is a bog? Well, all over England, you have this really interesting topography. You can visit it today. It's very much like driving from Worland to Thermopolis or to Tensleep. Let's choose Tensleep even better. It looks kind of like that, but what if you got out of your car and you started walking and all of a sudden you realized you weren't walking on dirt, but you were walking on water that looked like dirt, and you started sinking? That's the bogs. When dirt and water meet for so long that it starts to literally look like you can walk, and sometimes you can walk on it, and then all of a sudden the land will just give way, and you go right down into terrible, terrible, mossy, swampy, kind of boggy. It's very dangerous. You lose your children. What do? You invent stories about boggy-mans or boogey-mans that will eat you. Grendel is a boogeyman. He lives in those terrible bogs, and he's very frightening. Grendel sneaks into the Hrothgar's den, and he kills several of the men. He eats them. And immediately there's terrible danger now in the land of the Danes. Beowulf is a hero of another country. You'll be writing on this, by the way, here coming in regards to Beowulf's motivations. Beowulf is actually not Danish. He is from the land of the Geats. G-E-A-T-S, not geeks. Geats. And he hears about this terrible monster, Grendel, and he wants to fight him. So taking a few warriors, only 13, he jumps in his boat, and off he goes to the land of the Danes, where he arrives. By the way, I'm not going to tell the story very quickly. There's no real reason to flow this, by the way, too closely, because you have your packet, and it's all told there for you. Beowulf 1 will finish this way. Beowulf will arrive. He walks into Hrothgar. He will say to Hrothgar the king, I want to fight this monster Beowulf, and I ask, I can fight him without any weapons, barehanded. He is a man's man. He wants to grapple with the monster. Hrothgar's like, yeah, sure, no worries. Beowulf says, will you please send back to my family in the land of the Geats money, treasure, and my weapons if I die? That evening he goes to sleep, or he fakes like he goes to sleep. Grendel comes in to kill, and in fact Grendel grabs a couple of Beowulf's pals and he eats them. Beowulf jumps up, grabs Grendel, and we're told in the poem that the minute Grendel feels the hand strength, 40 men He has the hand strength of 40 men. The hand grab him, he immediately knows it's over. Sure enough, Grendel tries to get away, pulls away. The shoulder is detached, leaving Beowulf with only the arm of Grendel. Off Grendel goes to the swampy area where he ultimately will die. Hurrah, the end of Beowulf 1. Beowulf is the hero who has killed the nasty Grendel. Beowulf 2. Beowulf 2 begins with, oh yeah, Grendel had a mom, sometimes called Grendel's dam or Grendel's dame, and she's a witch who lives under the ground, and she's really upset that her boy got killed. She sneaks under cover of night into the mead hall, and she kills Hrothgar's favorite warrior, Aschir. Beowulf isn't there. In the morning, Beowulf is summoned, and he comes tramping in, we're told, and he asks, how goes it? And Hrothgar says, oh, it's terrible, everything is terrible. Aschir is dead. Beowulf will say, by the way, these lines are in your packet, the second to the last page. Sorrow not, brave one, he says. Better for man to gain glory ere death. This will be an important moment in the Anglo-Saxon motif, as we refer to it, of moral code. It is for a man to gain fame before he dies, and that's what matters. He says, I'll go and fight her, but I need weapons first. Interesting. He needs no weapons to fight Grendel the male, young, strong monster, but he has all kinds of weapons when he gets ready to go fight against an old hag. A double standard at play here, introduced for the first time in Western thought, and that is simply this. Guys fight fair, face to face. Never trust a woman. She will get you when you're not looking. And of course, that's exactly what happens. Beowulf almost dies in Beowulf 2. Ultimately, by using a special sword, he's able to kill Grendel's mom, and he cuts off the head of Grendel, takes it to the surface. 6 men have to carry that head to get it into the mead hall. And at the conclusion of Beowulf 2, there is a series of comments by Hrothgar, called the famous Hrothgar speech of Beowulf 2. It is not in your book. That's why I've put it in your packet. It's the last page of your packet, where Hrothgar will say, beware of pride. Now he says you are a great and mighty warrior, but soon you'll be old. And once you get old, you will be helpless. He says, I'm perfect proof of it. Beware of pride, and remember to always watch out for the fate that is inevitably coming. Beowulf 3. Beowulf 3 is a vindication of the Hrothgar prediction. Beowulf has been sitting on the throne of the land of the Geats for 50 years. When introduces into the story of Beowulf 3 an attachment, we believe, long after the fact added to the story, of a dragon, a terrible dragon. Now, it's interesting today, if you walked into any elementary classroom of 5th graders and said, tell me what you know about dragons, they would say things like, green with scales, and they shoot fire out of their mouth, and they can fly. And if you were to ask them, have you ever seen an animal like this? It is an interesting question. Where did dragons come from? I mean, for those of you who say, well, yeah, they got those kimono dragons, I'm sorry, those are not dragons in any way. I saw them as a child. They have no wings. They shoot no fire out of their mouth, but they are scary. But they are not dragons as we think of it. Beowulf, this poem, is one of the first places where a dragon like that is described in detail. This dragon lays for 1,000 years on a whole bunch of treasure, and when he wakes up, he knows that one of them has been stolen. Then he gets mad, he flies around. Beowulf says, I will go and fight the dragon, but I need help. And he draws on the help of a few guys, Wiglaf included. Wiglaf is the young star of Beowulf 3. But the minute that the dragon comes out of the hole, all of those guys run away, Wiglaf included. They're like, run away, run away. And Beowulf is left alone fighting against this terrible dragon. Problem, the dragon shoots out fire out of his mouth, and Beowulf's shield is made of wood. This is a problem. Wiglaf comes back to find that Beowulf has been bit in the throat and is about to die. Wiglaf will come up to Beowulf and say, don't worry, we'll kill this dragon together. And they do. Wiglaf has to help Beowulf kill the dragon. In his dying breaths, Beowulf will ask for 2 things. 1, he asks to see some of the treasure that the dragon has that he ultimately says he wants to give to his people. He's generous in his death. Beowulf also says, I never committed civil war. I never killed my brothers. That's good. And I always tried to tell the truth. That's good. But the last request of Beowulf is important.